Hello everybody, welcome to this tutorial at yet another solution.blogspot.com. This is the frames per second and slow motion tutorial number 7b. It's connected to the 7a where we cover up the older version of iMovie. This is the new version, the iMovie version 10.0.3. This is the new version in 2013, connected to the upgrade connected to Maverick. So this is called a quick guide, but to be honest it's a little bit longer than a quick guide because there are some really interesting new things we have to cover up here in this tutorial. So it is the overview of the tutorial. There are some few frames per second calculation that I'm going to show you. We are going to slow down some video in iMovie. We are going to slow it down half speed and even up to 10 times slower, and we are going to find out the frames per second limit in iMovie. So far I think the limit are 120 frames per second. I'm going to show you how I found out about that, so you can do that for yourself and maybe later upgrade, have higher frames per second limits, maybe up to 240 frames per second. We hope for that. And I'm going to show you how you can control the project's properties, the frames per second settings when you render out or you export the video. Earlier you could choose that directly in the project properties settings, but now it's kind of hidden. It's not possible to do directly, so here I show you a way around, and there are some things you can download for doing that. So as an example, if you have a Canon 7D, you have a 60 frames per second and you want to slow it down to the half speed, or maybe you have a Hero 3 or a Hero 3, the GoPro Hero 3 Plus, and you have a source file in 120 or maybe even 240 frames per second, and you want to slow down, you are coming to a correct tutorial. So here we have some easy mathematical things. We have for instance 240 frames per second source file, and we want to slow that down 10 times slower. Then we put in the 10% in iMovie. So this is an easy calculation, but it's not kind of nice to have this overview over this different calculation. So I put this into a slow motion convert table, I call it, because you have a different way to do it in the different software you use. So here we are in iMovie. If we for instance have a 120 frames per second source file and we want to slow it down 5 times slower, then we put in 20% in iMovie. So I think this is the limit in the new iMovie. This is the 120 frames per second. I think it's the limits that you can slow it down 5 times slower and still have a smooth slow motion, and then we end up with the 24 frames per second result. I'm going to show you that out in the tutorial here, but before we start, I'm going to show you that you are able to download some source file if you want to play around with a windsurfer clip in 50 frames per second or a cross-country clip in 240 frames per second. You can download it and play around with it in your software or in iMovie. And for sure you can also download this slow motion convert table at yetanother.solution.blogspot.com, and you can also download these frames per second switch files, I call them. I'm going to show you how I use them really soon, and it's really easy. So now we go directly into iMovie. And here we have some different video clips. We are first going to slow this down to half speed. I know that this is in 50 frames per second, so I'm going to be sure about that we end up with a result in 50 frames per second. So no, I mean in 25 frames per second. So I put this in first. So then we have this video clip here. I'm going to tell you about this in a little bit more detail after this, but first now we are going to slow down this to half speed. Okay, we put this into the timeline, and then we want to slow that down, and then after that we can delete this first file there, and we want to slow it down to the half speed. There are different ways to do that. We can go in under here and then modify and slow it down here, and we can go directly in and say 50%. I'm going to zoom a little bit so we can have a little bit more look at it. And we can also go in under here. If you see this turtle here, we can go directly in on the speed and a different speed here, and as well you can go here and go into the custom, and then you can put I know we are going to do the half speed, so and then it's really calculation is the 50%. So then you can see here that we have this smooth slow motion, and we can then export this and we can have a look at it. Okay, we put press share here and file, and we call this we can call this Windsurfer. Yeah, that's enough, and then we save that. Okay, here what is finished, and then we can show this file here. And if we open this Windsurfer clip, we can see here that under this information, I can show you where you find this information. This is the movie inspector here. If you show this under window there, movie inspector, there you can see that the frames per second here are 25 frames per second. That's really nice because the source file was 50 frames per second, and then we end up with the result of 25 frames per second. So if we see here, this is a smooth slow motion. Maybe this is not super smooth because I have this screen recording here, but you understand what I mean. Okay, that was really nice. So then we can go further on with some other files here. We then can delete this one, we can delete this one, and then we are going to have a look at this skier here, and we are going to slow that down. But before we do that, I want to have a look at the convert table, because I want to slow that down 10 times slower. I want to try that. As I told you, this version of iMovie don't cover even up to 240 frames per second. If you see here at the older version, this is a blurry picture because it's really zoomed in. Older versions of iMovie kind of covered up even up to 240 frames per second, I think, because you got some information about all the frames per second there in some way. But now we are going to do this conversion, and here we can see that if you want it 10 times slower, we then put in 10%. It's really easy mathematical things there for sure. Okay, we then also want to know about what the new frames per second will end up, and we will end up with 24 frames per second. So then it's nice to do this project settings with my way of doing that, and that's put this file in there. I'm going to show you that in detail later on in the tutorial, but we have to use it now already. Okay, here we have the skier. We can put it in there, and we can take away this file there, because now have the software chosen this speed. Okay, we can go in under here, we can go in under custom, and we wanted it 10 times slower, so then we put in 10% and press enter on the keyboard, and now we have this skier 10 times slower. But already when you kind of do some press on the keyboard, there are some frames that are kind of away. So if we export this, I can show you again in QuickTime Player that not all the frames are there. So we do again this chair, and we are going to do this file next, and we are going to call this skier 240 and 10 slower. Okay, and then we export that. Okay, here we are finished. Okay, I can show this file as well. Skier 240 frames per second, 10 times slower. So it looks kind of nice, but if you look here in under the frame number here, as you remember for earlier tutorials, we can then switch this. You can see every frames, and when you press on the keyboard, the arrow keys on the keyboard, you can see that some of the frames are the same. So then we have this 240 frames per second source file that end up with not so smooth slow motion. I can compare that to another file I have exported out in another software, where we have all the 240 frames per second there slowed down to 24 frames per second. As you can see here, the slow motion here are really nice. Of course, there are been some color correction here as well. But as you can see here, if I stop it and press with my keyboard, you can see all the frames are here. So as you can see here, all the frames are not here in the 240 frames per second. So as you can see here, there are a limit that the iMovie, this version of iMovie, don't cover 240 frames per second. So if we go into the convert table, if you have a 240 frames per second source file, I think the limit for that will be to do it 5 times slower. So we can do that. You can do it as a test now. We then put in 20%, as you can see here, 20% into the iMovie, and then we end up with 24 frames per second. As you remember, we have already chosen the 24 frames per second here, that we put this in front there. So then we can go this in under here again, and we can go here, and we can go in under custom, and we choose 20%, and then we end up with 5 times slower, and then we can try to export that so we can see how it's working. Okay, next here we can say skier 5 times slower. Okay, save that. Okay, there we have this file there. We can open this one, show this one as well. 5 times slower, and we can press play here, and you can see here that this looks smoother. It's a little bit faster, but it still looks smoother. So I think this is showing that we have we have the limit 120 frames per second. I can show you here that when I'm pressing the arrow on the keyboard, we have every frames with a new picture. I have even one more. We can show that on. We can take away this file here, delete, and we have a bird, a cool bird. It's an older clip, so it's not high quality on this video, but it's kind of cool with this bird. Okay, I'm going to put this in here. I'm going to do some small adjustment on it, so we have this kind of nice. Okay. Okay, here we are. There we are. I'm going to do this here. Okay, so as I told you, this is 120 frames per second file. So if we want this in smooth slow motion, in my opinion, we should then end up with we can do it 4 times slower, and then end up with a result of 30 frames per second, or if we want to even up to 5 times slower, you can end up with a file that have 24 frames per second. And for fun, we try that out with 5 times slower. So then we go here, and again, as you already have seen, we go into custom, and we go into 20%, and now we have this in 5 times slower. As you can see, this file here is not perfect. You can see it's really blurry. It's an old file with the older version of taken with the older version of GoPro. It's a GoPro Hero 2, I think. So it's but it shows that it's a really cool slow motion. I will for fun try to export that out as well. Okay, next you just call it bird 5 times. Okay, here we have it. We can press show there, and as you can see here, we have it's rendered out. We have this information here with 23.96, also 24 frames per second. And as you can see, it's really cool slow motion here. And if we take this back and forth here, I think it's really cool that we can see so much information or so much movement of this bird here. So in my opinion, this is really nice information, because when you use this convert table, you have kind of control over the different frames per second and how much you can slow down and still have the smooth result. Okay, then I have to go to this overview of the tutorial. we have now covered up the slow motion. We have covered up to find the limits of the frames per second. And now I want to, in the end of this tutorial, show you how you can control the frames per second. As you can see, I've already used it, because in earlier versions of iMovie, you can go in under the project properties. This is a picture from older iMovie. You can go in under project properties, and then there you could go in under here, and then you could choose the frame rate here. You can choose between the Cinema 24 frames per second, or PAL 25 frames per second, or the NTSC system 30 frames per second. I think exported was then 29.97 frames per second. So then I found out that this iMovie version, if you go in under the preferences here, there are some things to put in here that I take away, apply slow motion automatically, but there are no way to put in the frames per second. You can also go in under movie properties, and the movie properties, there are some information there, but there are not some information about the frames per second. So here I found out a way to come around that if we delete that. And again, if we want the clip that are in, we can say if we want the clip that are end up with 30 frames per second, we can then choose this file, which is possible to download at yetanothersolution.blogspot.com. We can put this in the start of the video. I'm going to take this timeline a little bit smaller. And then we have this 60 frames per second source file here, and if we put this after this 29.97 frames per second video in the start there, then we can delete this in the front there, because then we have kind of chosen the 30 frames per or 29.97 frames per second. The NTSC system have been chosen. Okay, then we can go in under there, and we can slow that down. For instance, we can slow it down to half speed, and when it's slowed down 60 frames per second to half speed, that's really easy calculation, then we end up with 30 frames per second. So we can then go in under here, and we can share that in a file. We can call it we can just call it a ski, and we can save that. Okay, and then it's this file ready. We can have a look at it. Ski there. Okay, in under this information we have we have this 29.97 frames per second, that's correct. And then we have this smooth slow motion here. Okay, so the thing is that if we want to change the frames per second, if we for instance have this, we can take this skier, I think. If we want this skier out here in this project, and we render out this will then end up with also end up with 29.97 frames per second. So if we want to change it to 30 frames per second or 23.98 frames per second, we then we cannot do that with just put this in front here. If we put this in front here, it's I found that this is still end up with a result of 30 frames per second. We then have to delete all the video clips here in the file. So we have then to have a clean start with this new frames per second. So we have to be really clear about how many frames per second we want in the end result. So we can go into the convert table, and we can for fun play around with this skier again. If we want this skier, it's a 240 frames per second. If we want it to be go down to we can say down to 60 frames per second, then we end up with we want to end up with a half of that, and we want to end it up with 29.97 frames per second. So then we put this in first again. So but as I told you, we have already chosen that. But again, if we want to slow this skier down to 5 times slower. We have already done that. Then we have to put this in front first. Okay, I think you understand. It's only for you to download this at yetanothersolution.blogspot.com, and hope you found this tutorial useful, and I hope you will be back for the next tutorial. Bye bye for now.